We'd like to introduce Clayton Thomas-Müller. Clayton is an award-winning film director, media producer, organizer, facilitator, public speaker, and best-selling author on Indigenous rights and environmental and economic justice. His book, Life in the City of Dirty Water, was a national bestseller and a CBC Canada Reads finalist. He was recognized by Yes Magazine as a climate hero and is featured as one of 10 international human rights defenders in the National Canadian Museum for Human Rights. He has campaigned across Canada, Alaska, and the lower 48 states in hundreds of First Nations, Alaska Native, and Native American communities to stop the encroachment of the fossil fuel industry on Indigenous territories. And before I pass it over to Clayton, I'll let you all know that one lucky participant tonight will be receiving a copy of Clayton's captivating memoir, Life in the City of Dirty Water, and the winner will be contacted by June 28th. And I just started reading it. It's fabulous. So, and with that, I will stop sharing my slides and hand it over to Clayton for his presentation.
Well, I want to thank Living Lakes and our incredible organizers for bringing us together here today. Big shout out to everybody who helped out. And yeah, hello to all of you that are tuning in from across these lands they call Canada. I'm tuning in from the city of Winnipeg in Treaty 1 territory here in Southern Manitoba. And I live between here in the city, and my home community, which is known as Pukatawagan Cree Nation. I guess it's about 56 parallel Northern Manitoba, right on the border of Saskatchewan and Manitoba, on the Churchill River. And so that's where my my family comes from. But yeah, my kids live here in the city. Today is a really special day. I right before I got on the Zoom here with all of you, I spent the day with my my kids. My oldest son graduated high school today, and you know, that's a really big, very special thing for me, because I never graduated high school. You know, I dropped out of school in grade 8, and you know, I was living on my own by the time I was 14. And so for my kid, you know, to graduate high school, it was quite a special thing. So yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to share that with all of you. If I seem a little bit like, oh, I'm very pleased about that. So you know, the goals of the time I have with all of you here today, you know, I want to open up in a good way with just a couple words of song to bring in the ancestors into the spaces that we're in. I appreciate the land acknowledgement. You know, I want to acknowledge the beautiful Indigenous nations, those ancestors whose graves of which this great city of Winnipeg is rose up from. You know, I want to acknowledge the mighty Métis Nation, calls the Red River Valley here where the city of Winnipeg is home. You know, and I really appreciate it. A lot of activists and hardcore, like, you know, the real hardcore activist types, they look down on land acknowledgements. They say, oh, it's a bunch of BS. But, you know, any good drug dealer knows that you got to have something to hook someone in, you know, for them to become a regular client, you know. And you know, people don't start off on the hard stuff. They start off on the gateway things. And that's what it's like for activism. You got to have those entry point, exciting, empowering things. And land acknowledgement is one of those things. So I always encourage people to learn the language of where you live. You know, to even just the swear words, you know, we always joke about that, but learn the Indigenous languages. You know, it starts with the swears, but then learn how to say water. Learn how to say water is life, you know, in the local Indigenous language. This is a very important thing. And so, yeah, I want to talk a little bit about some lakes that I worked very hard in my life to protect. You know, and those are the lakes that are in the Mackenzie River Basin, which is currently under threat by the largest industrial construction project in the history of the five-fingered species, so the human race. Race is just a construct, you know, something to facilitate power and control. We're all the same. The only thing that makes us different from the other animals in the biosphere that we share our lives with are these little guys right here, our thumbs. That's the only thing that makes us special and different. And so, but we're the same, you and I. And so, yeah, you know, I want to talk a little bit about the work I've done as an elite global campaigner, working on the jagged intersections of the global climate justice and Indigenous rights social movements. And I wanted to mention a couple of other frontline struggles, land defense struggles, water defense struggles, water protector struggles that I'm a part of, and then show a short video. And then I want to have some questions or reactions or, you know, whatever at the end. So that's the way I wanted to share the time with you today. If we're all cool with that, I'm just going to jump right into it. Oh, get you big Baba Jan, Wabi done man again. Making that go easy, oh, Chihuahua, Anishinaabe. Yahweh, 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 oh. Yahweh, 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 oh. Oh, get you big ba maran ba wamiran man again. Making that go eat you, Chihuahua, Anishinaabe. Yahweh, 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 oh. Yahweh, 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 oh. So, right off the bat, you know, this is a pretty wild time, you know, not just for Indigenous peoples, but I think for everybody who calls these lands that they call Canada home. I know for myself and my own family, you know, the pandemic hit really hard. You know, this they're calling it recession, but you know, it's not recession when there's record-breaking corporate profits. But you know, the economic recession certainly has hit our family hard. And you know, I think that on top of all those things that we're collectively experiencing, you know, living here in Canada right now in these crazy times, the Kamloops 2015 chapter in the, you know, murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and Indian residential school genocide legacy, you know, has been really, really challenging. You know, when a couple days after they had announced the Kamloops 2015, you know, the unveiling of unmarked graves at you know, you know, over 1,000 Canadian Indian residential schools. They had discovered anomalies outside the Indian residential school in Brandon, Manitoba, where I had spent a lot of time as a child. And I remember going to the current park. They had a big swimming pool there, an outdoor pool. And we used to always go there for like Canada Day and stuff when I was a little kid, me and my cousins. That was back in the day when you'd have 8 kids sitting in the back seat, no seat belts, you know. And we used to tease each other. We'd say, you're ever sick, you're gonna make you go sleep up there in the residential school all night. You know, it used to be a way we would tease each other as kids to try and scare each other, because we knew for sure that that place was freaking haunted. And so, you know, when a couple of days after the Kamloops 2015 thing happened, I was driving with my mother here in Winnipeg, And I said, man, I sure am upset about those unmarked graves that they found, Mom. How are you feeling? I know, as a residential school survivor. And I said, I'm just upset. They just announced more graves discovered at the Brandon Residential School. And she said, oh yeah. She just all nonchalant. She says, oh, that's where your father went to residential school. And it just rocked me because my dad, he's dead, he passed away, and we didn't really grow up together, but nobody ever told me where he went to residential school. And it was just in that passing, comment from my mother that she let me know that my dad went to that school. And I, began to spin and think about that. And, I began to think about my dad going back to school for the winter and just all of a sudden his best friend not being there. And then I began to think about when my dad died, and he died from cirrhosis of the liver. He drank himself to death because he was never able to heal from what happened to him at residential school. He experienced rape at the hands of nuns as a child at residential school. And I thought to myself, man, that'd be cool though, like when he went to the spirit world, or the good hunting grounds as we call it, that maybe his friends were waiting for him, his best friend that just wasn't there all of a sudden one year. Maybe they were waiting for him in the good hunting grounds, and maybe they're there feasting and hunting together, and there's abundance and happiness. And and now that they discovered their graves, all is right in the world kind of thoughts. But the point I'm trying to say, though, is that it's a really crazy, wild time, this era of truth and reconciliation. And for many Indigenous peoples, it's full of empty promises and hypocrisies. When we look at, what gets prioritized in the Canadian economy as far as expenditures and whatnot, when we look at the well-lubricated, the well-funded, racist, xenophobic campaigns of power and control by the elite and the wealthy in Canada, and who gets impacted the most, by that systemic racism, by existential threats like the existential threat of catastrophic climate change. It's Indigenous peoples, it's poor peoples, brown and Black peoples, and even some poor disenfranchised white folks, experiencing environmental, degradation across these lands. But by far, when we think about environmental racism in Canada, it is disproportionately a white and red issue, because the majority of card-carrying, law-abiding, voting Canadian citizens, they all live within 50 or so miles of the US-Canada border. And the rest of the country is inhabited predominantly by the 630 plus First Nations, dozens and dozens of Métis settlements, and dozens of Inuit hamlets in the circumpolar regions. And when we look at where the most destructive and water contaminating, climate wrecking, land, polluting industries tend to be, they are typically adjacent to, one of Canada's Indigenous communities. And so what you got is a circumstance where the people who are not burning the fossil fuel, the people who are not, cutting the forest down, overfishing our lakes, rivers, and oceans. You got those people that haven't done any of that stuff paying the highest energy costs in our economy. And those people are paying the highest costs in terms of impacts to their way of life, because of the climate change that our fossil fuel-centered agricultural complex, our fossil fuel-centered military industrial complex, every system essentially being fossil fuel centered. And so we've got a big task ahead of us right now as human beings, and there is no scientific debate. There's a 99% consensus in the scientific community that global warming is man-made, and there is a lot of data sets out there about the vital and crucial role of Indigenous peoples in helping human beings mitigate and adapt to the global climate crisis. Indigenous peoples know a thing or two about organizing and building power and rebuilding a destroyed economy juxtaposed against the end of the world. Because for us, our world ended. okay? And we've been living in a post, paradise essentially ever since the birth of this very young settler colonial state that we now call Canada. And so, we live in this era of truth and reconciliation. There's been a lot of promises, but still to this day, there are more kids living in the care of non-native government-controlled homes and institutions in the form of child and family protective services. There are more kids living in care, native kids in these non-native homes than there ever was in 150 years of Indian residential school genocide policy. Okay. And so, the problem persists. A really important metaphor for the non-native relative to understand here in these lands and waters that we share is that violence against the earth begets violence against women. And there is a undeniable, inextricable link between the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls crisis, scandal, controversy, and Canada's extractive industries economies. Because Canada's economic paradigm, its predatory, capitalist, neoliberal economic system is fundamentally based on the ongoing suppression of Indigenous peoples' collective rights. It's our treaty rights, our inherent rights, our Constitution, Section 35 rights. The ongoing removal of our people, the dispossession of our people from our homelands, the urbanization of our peoples, the taxation of our peoples. Mobility of rights for us, a right most Canadians are guaranteed through the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Because we live in an apartheid nation and Indians are governed under the Indian Act, our mobility of rights ends the minute we step off the Indian Reserve. Okay. And so we don't experience the same kinds of liberties, of social freedoms and social safety net that every other citizen has. Because if you decide, oh, I'm sick of BC, there's better schools in Manitoba, you can move to Winnipeg and rent a house and get health care and, have all of those things. But that doesn't exist for the natives still to this day. People don't realize that, And so the reason I'm talking about all of this is because, when you look across the country and you look at the way environmental racism plays out and who's paying the highest price as far as, the externalities displaced on local frontline communities by industry and by the governments they're working in collusion with, the people need to understand that whatever Canada does in implementing the 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that is inextricably bound and woven together with whatever Canada does to deal with the existential threat of climate change. Climate change requires a complete teardown of our current economic model and the building of a new one. The human rights and economic justice opportunities of that process are massive. We, right now, as human beings, are building the largest social movement in our history. Indigenous peoples know what it means to organize power after the world has ended, because for us, it already has. We are the experts in rapid adaptation. And so, it's really important that we understand this because, when we look at some of the most visible intersectional, environmental, and Indigenous rights campaigns, like, for example, the Indigenous tar sands campaign, many of you on this call have probably seen the massive pipeline protests that have swept across the planet and certainly across Turtle Island in the last 15 years. And this all came out of a social movement, strategic and tactical framework designed by Indigenous peoples. They embraced what's known as a rights-based approach, towards system change that put the emphasis on expanding a political base of resistance in Indigenous communities to stop the expansion of the Alberta tar sands and its associated pipeline infrastructure. And they did this because the tar sands They move more earth in the tar sands every single day, enough to fill up the Toronto Sky Dome. They've moved more earth in the tar sands than the Suez Canal, the Great Pyramids of Giza, the Great Wall of China, and the 10 largest earthen dams ever, biggest dams in the world ever constructed combined. Okay. The tar sands is a water-intensive marginal form of energy. It's a dirty, dirty, dirty form of an already dirty, energy source, fossil fuel, oil. And it requires a vast amount of fresh water that's been superheated into steam to blast the oil out of the 90% clay and sand mixture that they mine out from underneath the boreal forest in Cree and Dene and Métis territories north of Fort McMurray, Alberta. Now, when they blast that water out, it takes 4 to 6 barrels of fresh water for every barrel of oil they produce. All right. And so when you start thinking about that they're taking that water from the Athabasca River, which flows through Fort Mac, and they do recycle it as much as they can, but that final product, once it's been used so much and it's just loaded with naphthic acids, heavy metals, volatile organic compounds, persistent organic pollutants, uh, um, that sits in a network of tailings ponds, 13 tailings ponds that cover a surface area of about 270 square miles. You could see these tailings ponds from outer space. All right. And these tailings ponds are non-lined earthen dams. In other words, they are affected by the geological movements of the earth. The recent tailings failure at the Quesnel Lake gold mine that recently ruptured and destroyed Quesnel Lake, an active salmon economy, an intact salmon economy. It was an earthen dam like the 13 dams that they use in the tar sands. Now, the oldest tailings pond and the most well-researched tailings pond just so happens to leach about 11 million toxic liters per day directly into the Athabasca River. This is Suncor Tailings Pond number 1. There's 12 others that are much bigger than this one. This is just the most well-researched because it's the oldest. And so when you think about, the contaminants that are leaching into that river, it all goes downstream. And the bioaccumulation of all of those, cancer-causing toxins go up the food chain. And in the Mackenzie River Basin, the top of the food chain is human beings. It's Dene people, it's Métis people, it's Cree people. And there have been stories about deformities in the fish that they are catching in the Lake Athabasca fishery. There are stories about hunters pulling apart beaver dens, beaver lodges, and muskrat dens, and the reeking of petroleum. There are stories of hunters leaving entire kills, caribou and moose, just leaving them in the forest because their bodies are riddled in tumors. And the hunters and the elders of these territories all can make the link that this is an environmental factor, that is the determinant in what is a very scary cancer cluster. There's been more people, hundreds plus people have died in the sleepy village of Fort Chipewyan, a community of 1,200. Over 100 people have died from cancers in the last 10 years. And 6 of those cases was a rare form of bile duct cancer, which has been scientifically linked to the long-term exposure of mammals to polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, right? This is, petroleum. And for that amount of that particular type of cancer to appear in a population sample of 1,200, well, it's just not statistically, epidemiologically possible, okay? And so what does Health Canada say? Well, they say that, well, it's not as population sample's not big enough. They just give a bunch of bullshit. And I think they're finally getting a study now after 20 years of the community working with social movements to build power. But I bring up these lakes because, the Mackenzie River Basin is second only to the Mississippi River Basin as far as water drainage from the continental Turtle Island, what we call North America. And, Slave Lake, Bear Lake, Lake Athabasca, these are massive, massive sources of water. And the Mackenzie River flows all the way up to Tuktoyaktuk, where it eventually drains into the Arctic Ocean. And, I think that it's really important that we understand, the reality is that if just one of those tailings ponds were to burst, it would foul a third of the continent's freshwater resources. And I'm not too sure globally what the percentage is, but I do know that the majority of fresh water exists in these lands they call Canada. And with the realities of climate migration, the realities of the manifestation of never-ending wars and foreign U.S. policy and other military superpowers foreign policies, climate change and in the oil economy and the military industrial complex and never-ending conflict, these things are tied together. We address the energy crisis, if we electrify the North without fossil fuels, with cogeneration and battery storage, we do that in a way together, that's what's going to stop wars across the planet. This stuff in Israel, a lot of people don't realize that there's $1 trillion worth of natural gas just off the shore of Gaza. So wherever you see conflict on the planet, usually it's an indicator that there's some kind of rare earth mineral or fossil fuel available there. And so I challenge all of you, like be good environmentalists, be good conservationists. But the biggest success story of Exxon Oil, was to convince the public that your individual carbon footprint and the consumer choices you make around that would somehow address the global climate crisis. And that's a load of shit. We all have to dedicate some of our percentage, 23% or so of our volunteerism into system change, into things that dismantle systems of control and power like white supremacy, patriarchy. These are things that need to be dismantled. Systemic racism needs to be dismantled. We need to completely tear down our economy and rebuild something new. And while we're doing that to address the global climate crisis, we can correct historical wrongs. And, for Indigenous peoples, when we're talking about the protection of a third of the fresh water of Turtle Island in the Mackenzie River Basin or whatever, Indigenous peoples and our traditional knowledge play a crucial and vital role in our collective understanding and path forward when we talk about responding to the scale of the climate crisis. And we don't have a lot of time. We really, really don't, before things start getting unmanageable. So anyway, I shared some resources. I encourage you all to check out my book if you get a chance. It's just some ramblings about from a Native person about what it's like to grow up in one of Canada's inner cities. In my case, Winnipeg, which in my language means muddy water, hence the title of the book. But yeah, check out the 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Get involved in the movement for climate justice. This stuff is real, and it will become more and more impossible to not be active on the issue as the temperatures continue to rise. So.
Thank you, Clayton. Did you have
Yeah.
a video for us?
Yeah, I just wanted to end with this quick video, and then if we have got a couple questions, then that's great. Share screen. Yeah. One no.
We are one with the earth, with the sky, with the sea, with the sun. We are one. For Indigenous people, Unuhit, the notion that we are one, is a simple truth that has guided our life in ways that has sustained us since the beginning of time. We value the sacred knowledge of the earth that has been passed down to us through the generations, knowledge that can bring us the healing the world so desperately needs in this time. As we face the most critical challenge of our time, climate change, we urge all peoples to shift their relationships with the earth and with each other. As Indigenous youth, we are in the front lines of climate change, and we are also in the front lines of fighting it. Indigenous rights are imperative to climate justice because climate change is the result of colonialism. My ancestors were the original climate activists, beginning at first contact with our resistance to the desecration of our sacred lands and sacred waters. For hundreds of years since colonization, we have been saying that this colonial way of relating to our lands from a point of extraction, from a point of taking without reciprocity, without giving back, is flawed, and it will drive us to destruction. And now we are on the precipice of global collapse. We as Indigenous youth are calling on global leaders to do better. We've sacrificed everything for our lands. We've fought, we have died, we have had our children taken away from our homes because of these lands. And we are calling you to fulfill your responsibilities. Because it's not just about protecting our livelihoods, it's about the livelihoods of your children and your future generations and our ability to live on this sacred land.
No, y actualmente hay 33,000 personas que están en riesgo de perderlo todo por el levantamiento del nivel del mar. Nosotros no construimos combustibles fósiles y a pesar de ello somos los que más vamos a sufrir. Somos los que más sufrimos por el cambio climático. Estamos a punto de perder nuestra lengua, nuestra tierra, nuestra tradición, por la forma en la que viven en las ciudades. Así que tenemos que dejar estas palabras vacías, estas palabras de los gobernantes que no están haciendo nada, porque necesitamos acción ya. Necesitamos acción ya por las mujeres, por los niños, por la comunidad LGBT, por todo, por los pueblos indígenas.
Cool. Well, that's just a nice little video I like to share at the end of any talk because it just, those young people, they really capture things so eloquently and kind of put it all in one little. But yeah, I don't know if we got time for a couple questions, maybe, or reactions, or.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Let me just share my questions screen here and just say that thank you so much for that, for such a powerful presentation.
Territory.
Oh, sorry.
And I'm also the chair of the Emerging Indigenous Scholars Circle here at.
Oh, maybe I caught it. The old YouTube next on the playlist. Well, while Clayton gets that gets that all sorted, yeah, we'd like to open the floor to any questions. Feel free to put any in the chat if anyone needs some time to think about it. I do have some questions to get us started. Katie, were there any that came up in the chat before I just jump in?
I didn't see any questions. No, there were a couple of links and like facts shared, which is awesome. But I think you could go ahead and start with your questions, Camille.
Wonderful. Yes, Clayton. So, I mean, you shared so much with us, so much knowledge. Obviously, you're incredibly active, and I want to know what is the hardest part or the most, I guess, enriching part of the work that you do? That's probably a big question, but I'd love to.
I don't know that, like the answer to that's changed a lot for me. For sure, it's been like, to see the demise of my enemies, because like I've been pretty angry about the horrific injustices that I've bear witness to, across the many Indigenous homelands I've been able to organize in, and it's really hard to not let yourself get caught up in that, in the resentments and the anger and just the, frustrations over injustice. I think for me, it's really beautiful to see community that usually is inundated with stress, to have those moments of celebration that victory brings. When we defeated President Obama, and he reversed the Keystone XL pipeline decision. Yeah, Donald Trump, the first act he did when he got into be president was, reverse the pipeline back again. And then we had to fight him for 4 years. And then Joe Biden, the first thing he did when he became president was again killed the Keystone XL. So, your victories can often be short-lived, and the thing you're fighting to protect, the fossil fuel sector especially, they will wait until an entire generation of elders has died, and for the kids to have forgotten about the resistance and the stories and the songs of those elders. And they'll come in, 30 years later. They did that with the Mackenzie Valley pipeline, and with the Berger inquiry in the 70s. The Dene rose up and they stopped this crazy gas project in the Mackenzie Valley, and they wanted to build this pipeline and they stopped it. But then, they waited 30 freaking years and came back to the new generation, who was still dealing with socioeconomic crisis, the legacy issues with colonialism and, all the development issues that the North faces. And so they're very patient. So in those moments when you have victory, when you push just enough so that the good guys win, it's important to take those moments and celebrate, and I think that those have been, in my career anyway, those victory days are very meaningful, and to see people who just get so beat down a lot of the times to be in their power, and to especially in the United States, there's such a military superpower, and they play so dirty. And so when Indigenous resistance, fueled by social movement support, wins, that's a pretty cool thing.